אז ווק זה
מהפך,
הסיר,
כן.
וווק
וואו,
זאת האידיאולוגיה.
וואו, להתעורר.
אוקיי, אז ווק, המילה הזאת היא עושה כל כך הרבה רגשות, גם בשיח הישראלי וגם בשיח האמריקאי. יש כאלה שאומרים שטראמפ נבחר בפעם השנייה בעיקר בגלל, או כאיזשהו backlash לאידיאולוגיה הזאת. אילון מאסק קרא לה Woke Mind Virus, והוא אמר שאי אפשר לצאת מזה, אין לזה חיסון, ושהווירוס הזה זה מה שהרג את הבן שלו. וכאשר מדברים על הסיפור הזה, לפני שאנחנו בכלל הולכים, איך אומרים, להילחם אידיאולוגית עם הסוגיות האלה, חשוב בעצם להבין מה זה אומר. האם ווק זה בסך הכל כל מיני רעיונות של שמאל שלקחו צעד אחד קדימה מדי, או שיש פה משהו אחר. למעשה, אם אי פעם מישהו מכם ניסה להתווכח עם ווק, הוא שם לב שאין מה להתווכח איתו. למה? למה הפן הרגשי בתוך התנועה הזאת הוא כזה שלא מאפשר ויכוח? על כל השאלות האלה יש לי תשובות מרתקות, כי בשיחה הזאת דיברתי עם פרופסור אריק קאופמן מאוניברסיטת בקינגהם, ופרופסור אריק קאופמן הוא פרופסור לדמוגרפיה פוליטית ודתית, ולאחרונה הוא מפרסם ספר בשתי שמות שונים. השם, כן, שני שמות. אז השם הראשון הוא טאבו. How making race sacred led to a cultural revolution, או בעברית פשוטה, טאבו, איך לקחת את כל הנושא הזה של גזע ולהפוך אותו למקודש, הפך או גרם למהפכה תרבותית. והשם השני הוא The Third Awakening, כן? כמו woke, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. זאת אומרת, איך אנחנו יכולים לגלגל בחזרה ואת הפרוגרסיבי, האקסטרימיסטי הזה, ולחזור להיות נורמליים. ובספר הזה בעצם מה שקאופמן עושה, הוא מנסה להסביר את היסודות, גם הדמוגרפיים, אבל גם הפילוסופיים של התנועה הזאת. זאת הייתה שיחה מרתקת, ואחד הדברים שקאופמן מתעסק בהם בכלל, זה גם הדמוגרפיה של הדתיים. יש לו ספר שהוא טוען שהדתיים ירשו את הארץ, מכיוון שהחילונים או ליברלים לא עושים ילדים. כל הדוגמאות שלו הן לא דוגמאות על ישראל, אבל היה מאוד מעניין לשמוע מה הוא חושב בהקשר של התיאוריה הזאת על ישראל. וכמו תמיד, אם אתם נהנים מהשיחה הזאת, אז זה יהיה מאוד מאוד טוב אם תוכלו לעשות סאבסקרייב. למה? כי אז האלגוריתם של יוטיוב ידע להביא את השיחה הזאת לעוד אנשים חכמים כמוכם. אני יודע שהשיחה היא באנגלית, אבל אתם קהל חכם ואינטליגנטי, ואני מאוד מקווה שיהיה תרגום אוטומטי. ועכשיו לשיחה עם פרופסור אריק קאופמן. Professor Eric Kaufman, good morning. Thank you so much for coming today. How are you?
Good morning, Roy. I'm doing well. It's a rainy day in London. It's probably not raining where you are.
It's raining, but raining missiles. So
okay. Yeah.
But we have now a ceasefire that we don't know what's going on with the ceasefire, but this is interesting time to be in Israel.
Yeah, boy, yes. Well, it's a very different reality there than people living in the West.
Yes, definitely. So your family name Kaufman, I must ask, have you ever been in Israel?
You know, I haven't, and it's one of these things I really want to do. And so it's just for one reason or another, I've never managed to get there. But yes, I definitely want to go.
Because there is a video of your father in Israel speaking a little bit of Hebrew. So
Oh, really?
Can we
Yes.
conduct this? Can we conduct this interview in Hebrew? Or no?
No. I'm like you mentioned. You know, Americans who can't speak. I'm Canadian, but you know, it's just as bad. Basically, anyone who's a native English speaker, it's tough.
Yes.
A bit of French, maybe.
Tell me about it. Okay, so without any further ado, let's start. Your first congratulations for your latest book, and it has two names. The Third Awakening in the US and Taboo in the UK. I think the only writer which I had on the show which had two different names was Rupert Sheldrake, Sad Science 3, or The Science Delusion. And my question is, what does this tell me about the cultural atmosphere on both sides of the ocean? Because my prior intuition is that the average Joe in the US is more open to your ideas than in the UK. Am I right?
I'm not sure you will. I think that actually it's funny you asked that. I've actually done large scale social surveys on culture wars, attitudes in the UK, Britain, and in Canada. Now, normally we think of, Canada as the most woke country. The US is very split. It's got extremes on both sides and Britain in the middle. But the findings in the survey showed that the public opinion is almost identical in those three countries. And it leans about 2 to 1 against the woke position across 50 questions. And so the average Joe in all three countries is pretty sensible.
So, what is a more inflammatory title, Taboo or the Third Awakening?
Well, the US publisher, Taboo was the original title. The US publisher wanted something more aggressive. The thing about that US title is it's called The Third Awakening, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. So the second part of the title is really quite punchy. Um, and that's quite different. So the British title is more academic. So yeah, I'd say the
Okay.
second one more so.
Okay. Now, I must tell you that I also have skin in the game regarding your book and the woke movement because I think the lion's share, and it over 95% of the woke movement is anti-Israel. So the idea is it's not just a philosophy, it's something that we try to grasp and understand how the world liberal or the world left betrayed the Israeli left. And I think that it is very important to discuss this also in our
Mhm.
conversation. Now, before we dive deeper, could you take a few minutes and lay out the main argument of your new book? And in your opinion, where does it stand in relation to your earlier book, White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of the White Majorities?
Yeah, it's okay. So the thesis of the book basically is this. First, the definition of woke is very important to define this thing. Woke means the making sacred of
Sacred. This is a
historically
very important word.
marginalized, making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minorities. You make these groups sacred. They are totems, which means that if you offend these gods, you must be excommunicated from the community, that is canceled because you've profaned the sacred. And so it's a set of sacred totems. So that is really what woke is. My book is really arguing the case. There's been a number of books now, James Lindsay, Pluckrose, Chris Rufo, Yascha Mounk, Francis Fukuyama, that make the argument that what's happened is it's a kind of cultural Marxism. They took uh, the Marxist console, which is about oppressor versus oppressed, everything's about power relations, and they pulled out the cartridge that said class and they stuck in the cartridge that says identity. Now that's part of the story. But it's a very intellectual explanation. My argument is that, in fact, the bigger force is the role of a kind of left liberal overreach through humanistic psychotherapy. So you take psychotherapy, the humanistic psychotherapy, which says always affirm your feelings. You take that and you turn the dial up to 100, and you get to emotional trauma, emotional safety. Be kind, but it's the idea of saying be kind, but taking that to an extreme means anything you say that might be seen as unkind to a member of one of these groups, you can't say. And we have to shut you down through a speech code or cancellation. And so I emphasize much more this humanistic left liberalism, which I think has guardrails. When it comes to economics, left liberalism is moderate because it's blending free markets and redistribution of wealth. When it comes to culture, it's extremist because has no guardrails on the two core principles of equality and emotional harm protection. And so we've gone off the deep end culturally. So my argument is that whereas a lot of those other books say, neo-Marxism has corrupted a pure liberalism. My argument is no, actually, the modern liberalism essentially has metastasized into this kind of psychotherapeutic extremism where we're talking about trigger warnings and microaggressions and safe spaces. That is all a psychotherapeutic language. Now, there's a whole lot more in the book that I talk about in terms of how this spread and what to do about it, but we can get to that later.
Okay, so I want to start with two things that you mentioned. One is the class versus identity. And there is a profound difference between because in class, you can make a class war and shift between one class to another class. And this is I think the main fact that communism didn't work in the US in the first place, because the class mobility in the US was very high. You can come up with low class, and you know the
Yeah,
no, Andrew Carnegie story, you know, as
right.
a but in identity, you are stuck with identity, and you cannot change your identity unless you make an operation. And this is why a sexual transformer operation, you know, from being from boy to girl, are just in white people. Okay, this is the only way that you can make this change. And the other thing that you mentioned is be kind. And we take be kind to the extreme, but this is not fully 100% right, because we need to be kind only to specific groups. And there are some groups that we should not be kind and it should not be tolerated at all. So if you could please elaborate on those two aspects.
Exactly. Yes. So I guess the point about, well, first of all, you mentioned class, and yes, it is true that you move to something that is more ascribed and not as changeable. However, what's interesting about it is I don't think this idea that it's all about human liberation from your identity so you can change and be whatever you want. I don't think that's the main driver, and I'll tell you why. I think, okay, that might apply to changing sex. But let's just say you're white and you want to be a black person. You want to say, oh, I'm gonna be black now. That's a taboo. So it depends what you're trying to change into. If you're tr there are different rules for different categories. So I don't think that really works across all categories. The second thing is when you talk about be kind. Yeah, you're right. There was a book called Against Empathy by the Yale philosopher Paul Bloom, who said, he talks about the dangers in empathy. So any philosophy which is about empathy, well, the question is empathy towards who? If you're really empathetic towards people of color, that almost necessitates you being hostile to the oppressors of so-called oppressors of people of color, which are white people. Now this is where Jews and Israel comes in, right? Because once you get tagged as the oppressor, then you are free to hate. There is no limit on how much you can hate these people. And so the flip side of feeling very empathetic emotionally towards a victim group is you can feel it's open season on the victimizer. And again, it's a clash of empathies. And this is what these people don't understand. So if someone says, I'm trans affirming and I'm in favor of trans rights, that's a way of essentially framing something that is really a clash between trans rights and women's rights. What you've done is you just erased the women's rights parts and you've just got trans rights left, and you can say, I'm in favor of trans rights. And so it's a very neat rhetorical framing. But yes, you're right that this be nice thing, it's always meant to be about towards the weak and vulnerable. But of course, weak and vulnerable is a construct, and it changes. And so the constructs that count are race, gender, and sexuality, and specifically race at the top of the oppression pyramid. So where you are on the oppression pyramid is constructed by the ideology. They don't care about many other dimensions. So, for example, every black person at Harvard could be very light-skinned and of West Indian or African immigrant origin, mixed race. That wouldn't matter at all as long as you had your quota of 13% black. So they don't care if every Latino looks essentially like a white American. So skin color doesn't matter, but it's just the categories that matter. And so they fixated on these three sets of categories within which they then apply their be kind philosophy. If you're outside those categories, you don't count.
And the empathy that you are speaking about, you know, I watched Am I Racist recently, and I came across a notion that I was unfamiliar with: over smiling. Over smiling. So if you are
I
if
hope
you
I'm not
see
over.
yes, I'm a Mediterranean Jew, can hardly speak English. It was very offensive. But the idea of over smiling is basically, if as a white I see a black person and I smile, but if you over smile, It means that you smile in a derogatory term. But again, you are not mean to be derogatory in any way. So the idea of, and I think this is basically goes back to what Aristotle said, practical wisdom. There is the notion of being kind and being nice and empathy and affirming your emotions. But when taken to extreme, this whole thing collapses. And my question is, where do we, I think we cannot obtain the ratio, the correct ratio from logic, because my logic is different than your logic. And we need a practical wisdom, like I would say a transcendent source to fine tune how much we need to be kind. And I think that this fine tune dial is completely broken.
Hmm. Well, I think one of the problems is that progressivism, which is really left liberalism, it's a blend of strands of expressive individualism coming from liberalism with egalitarianism, this idea that men and women should be equal, that white and black should have this equal share of all positions in society. And then you have this harm protection, this emotional harm protection stuff. And these things have come together into progressivism, which is the dominant ideology in Western societies and is now presenting itself as natural and not political. This is part of what this ideology does. It styles itself as, no, this is just being moral. It's something everybody believes in, being nice. The other problem is, of course, that what applies in personal relationships. So I might not say what I think of my mother-in-law's weight to be nice in a personal conversation. And I may not just say the truth. And that's good because that's how
It's not
social
just
relationships.
nice, it's also smart, being smart. This is, I
Yeah,
think, much more important.
yeah,
Being
yeah,
smart.
exactly. So what applies in social interaction and lubricates social interaction and is the right way of operating in private interactions is a disaster when you take it out of the private realm and put it into the public realm. When you start hiding the truth so that you don't offend somebody, and when the authorities start imposing speech restrictions and speech codes to avoid you speaking truth and freedom, freely speaking, then you have an authoritarian society. And so the move that a lot of the extreme psychotherapeutic humanitarians have made is they've taken that be nice ethos and they've transposed it onto the larger public realm unproblematically, thinking, well, of course, be nice. We all want to be nice. Yeah, we can be nice in our private interactions, but it's very different to enforce an ethic of niceness in public. And that's what they've done. And this is a disaster, an absolute disaster. So, we've seen already a number of great examples from Canada, where I'm from, the claim that there are 215 Indigenous children buried in these Catholic schools in Western Canada, Christian schools, is a complete hoax. It's a complete Pizzagate lie. But none of the politicians are willing to call that lie out because that might offend the sensibilities of members of these Indigenous communities, and that they've decided is a no-no, right? That's an example of where we're suppressing truth to be nice. But of course, in the public realm, that's actually upholding lies.
And I think, the other side, I think that the distinction is very important. There is a private and the public realm. But again, and this is something that conservative, and I also consider myself in the political aspect or the political term, leaning to the conservatism, telling the truth doesn't imply being rude. So
Hmm,
you can tell the truth because people usually, they take the phrase facts don't care about your feelings. Okay,
right.
facts truly don't care about your feelings. This is absolutely 100% right. But there are many ways to display and to convey those facts, and you should try to take the less rude way. Okay,
Hmm,
and I think which leads me to my next question, because you said that the woke is basically was established as a liberal left. Some people think that the woke movement is just liberal values taken to the extreme, like we just said, be kind, be nice, empathy to the 100% dial. But you emphasize the emotional aspect of wokeism, which make it resistant to rational debate. And my question is, can you explain why this emotional foundation is so central in this movement and why is it so difficult to challenge? Or, I think a better question, how can we challenge it?
Yeah, so one of the main differences between my book and some of the others that have been written on woke is that I don't put as much emphasis on the intellectual lineage and the role of intellectuals in this idea of a war of position and a march through the institutions. It's not that they don't, of course, they are trying to march through the institutions, but I don't think the deliberate intentionality is there. What I think is going on is this is a movement, very much a bottom-up mind virus in which people are captivated by images on television. The civil rights movement, this was the beginning of the anti-racism taboo. Now, of course, the civil rights movement was a good thing, but the story, the narrative of oppression, of overcoming oppression, um, captivated minds, and people formed these emotional attachments to particular groups, African American, and then Indigenous, and then women, and then other victim groups. So this is really about particular empathy towards particular groups. And the flip side of that, of course, is hatred and antipathy towards their oppressors. So this is all about emotional, um, emotional feelings of positivity or negativity. And so I put a lot of emphasis on this idea of majorities are bad, minorities are good, is a kind of crude, it's not exactly that, but it is roughly the crude emotional makeup. Once you've got that emotional makeup, if you read Kahneman and Tversky, right? I mean, people aren't rational, they rationalize. They have those emotions and then they make up different theories, and that could be, postmodernism, post-colonialism, critical theory, all of those high cultural things, I argue, are rationalizations for these emotions. But it's those emotions and those attachments that really matter. And so if white people are evil and men are evil, that's an emotional feeling, and that, to my mind, is much more important than talking about, systems of power and systemic this and that, which are the rationalizations for the emotions. Those emotions are driven by events, by images, by exemplars and myths, stories. We have to find a different story. One of the reasons I place so much emphasis on changing the way we teach history is that we need to alter the emotional charge that people are attaching to particular historical incidents and to particular groups. And so if we're gonna talk about slavery and genocide and colonialism um, conducted by white people, I don't think we should be allowed to do that in schools without talking about slavery, genocide, and colonialism conducted by non-white people, because we have to take the emotional, it doesn't change the facts that there was slavery in the US, but it will take the emotional sting, the emotional charge away from this idea that it's whites who are solely and uniquely and exceptionally responsible for this sin.
So basically, what you're saying is you can keep teaching Howard Hughes' book, The Common History, the People History of the U.S., but again, you need to teach it with the broader, I won't say correct
Mm.
or more correct, but the broader context of slavery was everywhere in history, and the United States was the only place in history where abolition was existed. So this you said will take the sting out of the emotion. But again, maybe this is what you said. I can rationalize it differently. Maybe the intellect, maybe the facts, and this is a core principle in your argument, doesn't count so much. So if
Mm.
I take, I will give you more facts and I will put it in a broader context. But if we are talking about emotions, you can't fight, you can't compete emotion with facts. So
Yes.
how can the broader context can can be a savior to our problem here?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what this would mean is that we would need, movies and novels and art and other uh, forms of communication meaning making communication that would be more getting at the emotions. And I think that's right. I'm absolutely right. I mean, and in a way, one of the problems is that the left has got such a dominance in all of those areas. They control all the institutions and they produce almost all of the artists and filmmakers. And so it's going to be very difficult to challenge that. And I don't quite know how we get out of this hole. I think you can start by the strategy that I've come up with is you take the small amount of talent that the right has in these areas and you have to leverage that. So every artist, every filmmaker, every novelist that is conservative, they have to have a big impact. The good thing is that most books sell no copies. The vast majority of, films, the vast majority of art goes nowhere. So as long as that small group is able to punch way above its weight, I actually think we can get balance back into the system. But you're right, we need to be telling stories and not just talking facts. But the other thing I should say is, though, I think that something like design of the school curriculum, there we can use facts as a way to at least slow down the indoctrination process of young people.
Slow
Yeah, because
down. But I
I,
think,
yeah,
yes,
I should say one other
yes,
thing.
please.
Just I'll give you a statistic. So seven out of 10 Americans under the age of 25 believe this statement to be true. They agree with this statement. Um, the native peoples of North America lived in peace and harmony before the European settlers arrived. They believe that. So that's the mountain we have to climb. That's how much disinformation has entered the system.
I think it was from one of Louis C.K. stand-ups. I think this very sentence was delivered by Louis C.K. And if Louis C.K. said it, so it must be true. And I want to give two examples. One is the Daily Wire Lady Ballers and the new Cinderella, I think. They tried to make art, funny, entertaining art that can speak to the level of emotions which where facts cannot. And the other thing, I watched Fury, which is a war movie with my wife recently, and she told me, listen, there is no one Hollywood movie about wars that doesn't, portray war in a very bad colors in a way that no matter what, we don't want another of this. And I think that this notion that Hollywood conveys to the audience that no matter what, we don't need another war because war is horrible, like what I just showed you, is one of the reasons that we are here where we are. Where because if you there's something more important than life, and if you and they say I think this is a very very profound way. You must be willing to take war or to participate in war or start war in order to protect what you have. And the current Hollywood trend, and it's not just current, in the last 10 or 20 years, is all the movies are anti-war. War is a bad, horrible, horrific thing. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that they always make it out to be horrific. I mean, obviously there are a few World War II films, but I mean, I'm just thinking of Saving Private Ryan and these. I mean, it's seen as awful, but there is a heroic element to some of the war
No, yeah,
films.
yes, of course, of course.
But but yes, I mean, dying in battle as a sort of yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I think in some cases they just dying in battle is a good thing for them, but in most cases it's mainly about particularly the Vietnam War themes. Obviously that was not a great
Yes.
war for the US. um but I don't think it's always the case. I think there is still some heroism left, but that's an interesting thesis, I think. Yeah.
And again, Saving Private Ryan is a great movie based on a true story. Okay, and the idea of I want to save Private Ryan because two of his brothers already passed away, and I don't want
Mhm.
his mother to lose another child. But all the context is that war is a horrific thing, and we must do whatever we can do in order to prevent this war. And I think this was the exact atmosphere before World War II. We
Mm.
saw the horrific the atrocities of World War One, and Chamberlain and all the other people in the US said, no, I will let Nazi Germany, equipped itself with missile, but I don't want another war. And this is exactly how Churchill starts his book. Now, I want to go on to another point that you raised. You mentioned that cultural attitude formed during young adulthood tend to remain sticky throughout life. Now, in the past, it was assumed that people would grow out of useful idealism. Like the saying, if you're not socialist before 25, you have no heart. And if you are still a socialist after 25, you have no brain. However, and this is another great point that you raise, it isn't happening with today's generation, especially with core woke value. So my question one is why, and question two, how can we address it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll just give you a few examples of the generational divide on some of these questions. Um, the Google programmer James Damore, who was fired for circulating an internal memo about why there aren't so many women in programming based
In
completely on science.
2017, so
Yeah.
wow.
So two-thirds of British and American respondents in my surveys under age 25 supported. They said it was a good thing they fired him, two-thirds. Whereas anyone over about 50, it's only between a quarter and a third that support that. Another example, should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publisher? Uh, for anyone over 45, it's like maybe under 5% would say that. For the under 25s, they're split 50-50. There's a huge, and I've done other studies looking at academics. If you take left-wing academics over 50 and left-wing academics under 35, the under 35s are twice as likely to support firing for speech as the over 50 left-wing academics. And so we've got a big problem. Now, there is there are some positive signs which I just want to also mention, which so one of the positive signs is so we have an indoctrination system in the West in the school system because of the teachers, particularly the influential teachers coming from the education schools at university, are heavily woke and marinated in this ideology, and that so the ethos of their schools tends to reflect that. And in fact, I've done one of the studies I did with Zach Goldberg in the Manhattan Institute. We looked at how many critical race and gender concepts like systemic racism, unconscious bias, white privilege, many genders, how many of these terms had 18 to 20-year-old Americans heard in school? And the average level was over 90% had heard at least one of these terms. The more terms they'd heard, the more woke they were. So the indoctrination is working. We've done a bunch of statistical tests. So indoctrination is happening and it's working. Now, the only positive thing I will say is that people like you, podcasters, the online world is a check on the influence of indoctrination through the institutions. And so what we're now seeing amongst the young people is a growing divide. A lot of people who weren't political are drifted into the anti-woke camp. And so we actually now have a bit of a fight going on, a very intense polarization over these issues in that generation. And I think this is going to be an interesting story. So we see differences. In Britain, the young people, they're very left-wing, partly because the Conservatives were in power for 14 years and Britain left the European Union. But in Canada, they're actually, relatively right wing. And in Europe, they're quite right wing as well. So what I see is you've got a much larger group of young people who believe in woke, but you also have a group mobilized against woke. And I think that's probably going to help shape our politics in the future. I also think those views are quite sticky, certainly amongst people who, now, it's not to say they can never be shifted. If we have a big change of mood, then that will shift even those people. And you've seen that a little bit with defund the police, which might have been something more people would have supported, and now it's very unfashionable. And so I'm not saying it's immovable, but I think the generational dynamics, as the median voter, is becomes a Zoomer in 20 years, the median corporate leader. It is possible that our free speech, truth-based order is going to be upended in favor of a therapeutic, feelings-based order based on speech censorship. I think that's a distinct possibility because people's brains stop making connections in their 20s, and a lot of beliefs crystallize, musical taste and a bunch of other things, and they don't shift very much over the life course. And I worry that the people who are true believers in this ideology, it's going to be very hard to move them in the decades ahead.
And this is a very, I think, an important problem because tend to be more divided than ever. Elon Musk posted a tweet, I think, 2 years ago, that he basically stayed wherever he was as a classic liberal, but the current left trend make him
Mm,
like a alt-right almost. And I said, no, I'm not
yeah.
alt-right. I just stayed exactly where I was. And it seems to me two things. One, that in taking the extreme, the left side has gone much further than the right side. This is one. And the other thing is that I can see how people in the social science, in the humanities, can be attracted or attached to those ideas because this is part of, Claudine Gay did her PhD basically on these topics.
Mm.
But we also see that these approaches go back to the STEM, and which raises, I think, a significant question: how those woke things can live with STEM, with science, technology, with math faculties.
Well, I mean, I think in the science faculties, they're more likely to be mugged by reality, if you like. So it's harder to have, if you take critical race theory, for example, this idea that there's this mysterious matrix we're all trapped in that is making us racist. Um, that's not a measurable, testable hypothesis, so it can never be falsified. And so they can carry on spouting whatever they want to spout, and they'll never actually have to face reality. But if you say, oh, gravity is a social construct and it's not real, and all of a sudden something heavy falls on your head, that's the end of your critical theory right there. So I think there's more of a check in the sciences. And I think the inroads that, if you look at the impact that woke is making on the sciences, it's either just about a kind of DEI tax, like you have to have a certain amount of women and blacks and Hispanics in the science enterprise, and or it's that racism in science, we're going to fund that project, so there's a certain tax paid so that everybody else can get on with their particle accelerators and their medical research. Now there are a few areas, particularly in medicine. So for example, if you say puberty blockers don't work, it's you're not going to be able to do that research. So there are certain constraints in parts of the sciences, but I think generally because they're dealing with inanimate objects and processes, it won't be affected. It's the social sciences and particularly the politicized disciplines. So everything except economics, which is just going to be, it's completely corrupt. I mean, it's like a ski slope. I use the analogy of a ski slope where you're allowed to ski on the slope and you're not allowed to go off piste. But half the questions are off piste. And so one of the things I'm trying to do at the University of Buckingham, which is the only free speech university in Britain, is to set up this center for
Yes.
heterodox social science.
Now, I must ask you, because with your permission, I beg to be differ about what you just said. Now,
Okay.
you're absolutely right that if I study genetics and I study intelligence, I can see the data. I can see, one standard deviation for a Southeast Asian and the Ashkenazi Jews and the black. I can see all the data. But in the STEM, it is very true that you can deny gravity because if you deny gravity, something very bad happened to you. This is absolutely true. But we still have the DEI departments in the STEM field. And we also have recently Israel was abolished from the National Academy of Math because of what's happening right now in Gaza. So yes, we know that 1 + 1 = 2, even if you're black, Latino, Hispanic. But it seems to me that some of the trends and values of work are finding their way into the STEM field, not in the research paper, but in all the thing around them.
Exactly. So yeah, if you look at, say, Scientific American or Science or Nature or any of these popular science publications, the further we get away from the actual papers and hardcore hard science research, all the ethos, the hiring, the HR, all of this stuff around the hardcore science is corrupt. And so, science, it's a joke of a publication, right? So, yeah, what you described exactly. So, what I see this DEI doing is it's putting out certain restrictions. You can't use Native American fossils. You can't study puberty blockers if you come to the wrong conclusion. So, there are certain limits, and those are distorting our knowledge a little bit. But it's the bigger problem is this DEI tax that everyone has to pay. And of course, if you are, say, Israeli, there are certain restrictions on you. I still think, however, that it's not as, that we're talking, everything's bad here. We're talking about what's extremely bad and what's simply bad. So
Mhm.
in the social sciences, it's much more foundational. So if you say, for example, the gap between men and women in pay or between blacks and whites in pay is not due to systemic discrimination, you're not going to get published. So the whole field is completely bent out of shape. I mean, this paper that came out in Science the other day, very recently, claiming that there's discrimination against women and people of color in academia, academic promotions. I mean, and the data, you look into the data, the whole conclusion rests on about five people. And the rest of the paper, actually, the rest of the data completely shoots down. I mean, the very strong finding is that if you're white and Asian and you want to go for promotion as a professor, you're discriminated against. They just don't mention that. So the whole state of knowledge, the whole meaning making, knowledge producing sector is systematically biased and warped. And so we're not actually getting truth. I think now that's happening to a degree in the sciences. I mentioned puberty blockers, so there are certain areas where this is going to matter, but I still think the overall science enterprise is not going to be as corrupted. The knowledge they produce is not going to be as biased as we see in the social sciences.
Let me give you a counterexample because I think this is very important. And I wrote a book about intelligence. Now, we know that there is a backlash movement in the US. We now have this term DEI hiring. Okay, you are DEI hiring. You weren't hired because of your skills. You were hired because of your gender and color. And when Claudine Gay got the position of the president of the Harvard University, I assumed that DEI hiring was part of the thing, and now I'm sure. But Lawrence Summers, which was the also a president of the Harvard University, had this speech about women have less aptitude in the STEM field, and after this uh, incident, the NSF said, and the NSF is a very big organization that donate money, that it will not support any research that want to show that there are brain differences between men and women. And Richard Heyer, which is the editor of the journal Intelligence, told me, listen, Alzheimer is progressed differently in men and women. And if I can research how Alzheimer is progressed differently because the brain is biologically different, we can't come up with a cures for Alzheimer which targeted to a specific gender. So it's not just puberty blockers, which I think it's a
Mm.
very nuanced example. This is
Right.
something much more profound. If you don't let me tell the truth, science and the truth will not appear.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. Yeah, and there are other areas in the sciences. I mean, I think especially as concerns, for example, fossils that are deemed to be of religious importance to Native Americans. Of course, a lot of that has all been recent construction. Um, yeah, and other area. I mean, I think where access to databases has been restricted depending on your research questions. All of these violations of science. So that's happening. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not happening at all. It is happening. It's just that it is happening. It's just what percentage. what percentage of the science enterprise is corrupt versus what percentage of the social science enterprise is corrupt. I just think the percentage corruption is higher in the social sciences because almost everything has been tainted by politics. And I could give you many examples, but obviously the one about explaining inequality, you can't look at family structure, and say, well, a more intact family, you're going to have fewer social problems. That's exactly the kind of thing you can't do, but it's so fundamental to explaining inequality and different outcomes. That's what I mean. It cuts to the core of the social sciences in a much more dramatic way, but it's a problem in both, and I think we got to get it out. And I'm very interested to see what the Trump administration and Rufo and all these people can do. So, so,
And it is very funny because Obama can say that the biggest, I think, problem in black families today is people growing up without a father. So
mm,
Obama can say it because he is on the right side of the political map, and he knows the statistic that growing without a father is, I think, the major factor in all of bad things that can happen to you. And he said, listen, yes, growing without a father is a very bad thing. And we can, trace it back to the Head Start and to the uh, Johnson administration. But this is, again, the fact. But some people can say the facts. And some people, if they say the fact, I cannot imagine what will happen if Donald Trump say the biggest problem black families are dealing with is going out without a father.
well, it's funny though, because you mentioned a little bit earlier how the whole political spectrum has shifted to the left, and what was once seen as a left-wing position is now a right-wing position. I think this is also important in this case because Obama also deported large numbers of people. Bill Clinton, his attitude to gays in the military, don't ask, don't tell. So some of the things that,
Mm.
Obama and Clinton did, even Hillary Clinton, those are now beyond the pale. I mean, one of the reasons that the Democrats got clobbered in the election was because they refused to control the southern border. The reason they refused to control the southern border is that it was now seen as racist to deport people because most Americans are white and most people coming across the border are people of color. Therefore, what this is systemic racism. And so that's one of the reasons they couldn't deport people. Whereas Obama could, and in fact, just recently, maybe just today, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, said, go back and watch videos of Barack Obama and what he said about deporting illegal immigrants and go ahead and try and cancel me. So his attitude was like,
Mm.
we've gone crazy. Look at what Obama says. It was okay then, but it's not okay now. And he's trying to push back against the woke left. So I think part of what's happened is just there's been this creep and extremism in the definition of racism to mean more and more and more things. Going hiking is racist because most people who hike are white. Deporting illegal immigrants is racist. So all of a sudden, all of these things that were once okay are now not okay. Talking about the black family, it's another example where you Obama could say it, but do you think Kamala Harris would say it? No,
And
absolutely not.
when I prepared for this interview, I came back to just a second. One, two. Thomas Sowell, intellectual and race, and basically, it seems that nothing has been changed in the last 20 years because I think basically the main argument of this book, which is a great short book, by the way, is that those affirmative action and all those politics, and this was before the DEI movement, are harming the black people. And I think one example is worth reading. And basically, the MIT students, the black MIT students are the top student in the US. But
Hmm.
because of the DEI or the affirmative action, they rank the lowest in the MIT scores. And basically, what Thomas Sowell said, if you have taken those black students and put them in any university in the US, they will rank, they will score the highest. And there will
Hmm.
be, the top students, and the black as a top student in any university in the US. But MIT is an exceptional in any way. And when you take those brilliant students and force them to rank lowest on their class, you basically said signal to everyone, they rank lowest. But you could easily, if cancel the quotas and cancel the affirmative action, make those students be shining stars. And I think
Yeah.
this is a very eye-opening example of those policies harm the people that they try to serve. And
Yeah.
I think it
Well, yes.
always happen.
Well, this is exactly what's called the mismatch hypothesis, and there was a good work by Richard Sander, 2004, detailed study of black law students entering law school. What happens is these students come into universities that are above where they should be admitted. They fall to the bottom of the class, so they leave the professions, the disciplines that lead to high-paying jobs like law, science, and they
Engineering.
go and take Africana studies because that's an easier course. And so what you're actually doing is you're failing these students. And these are the people you're supposed to be trying to help. And there's many examples like that. So if you say defund the police because you think there's a higher percentage of black men in the jails than in the population, and so you say, oh yeah, well we have to decarcerate. You allow the worst elements back into their communities. They basically make it impossible to accumulate capital, to build a business. Same in the classroom. If people who are being excluded from class are disproportionately black, and you crack down on that, well, then you allow the bad apples to ruin it for the other black students. So what happens as a result of all these policies is so after, the Ferguson effect, after Black Lives Matter, you just had a lot of, as many as 15,000 extra black people were killed as a result of defund the police and the whole Ferguson effect. And similarly, I think we could make the argument that the number of smart black students has been reduced substantially by the inability of these schools to have discipline against bad behavior in class for fear that this is having a disparate impact on black students. Again, that's damaging black success, black achievement. And yeah, this is rife throughout the system. But as Thomas, well, not Thomas Sowell, but somebody who was a fellow traveler of Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, in his book White Guilt, another African American conservative. His argument is that affirmative action and all these programs are all virtue signaling. They're not actually meant to narrow gaps. They are all about demonstrating how you are a white ally. You're one of the good whites, not one of the bad whites. And aren't you holier than thou? And that's the only function for these programs. The function is not to actually do anything for the group involved.
And I think many people, I heard it many times, that the Johnson administration, who came up with affirmative action and Head Start and all the things, was basically anti-black administration. So in a way, the Johnson administration understood that those policies will keep the black within the Democratic Party. So it is
Yeah, I mean,
an interesting way to look at it.
look, I don't want to be conspiratorial. I mean, yes, obviously there were Southern Democrats, but they were starting to leave the party. I mean, I'd say what I think it is more is that they saw these riots happening in the American cities. They felt threats to social order, and they thought we'll buy them off with affirmative action. We'll give them a sop. And then they justified that as somehow being necessary in order to remove discrimination. So they justified it after the fact, but the real motivation was actually a kind of cowardice. That's the start of affirmative action, and then cynically, Richard Nixon actually advanced it cynically, and so this becomes a monster, and that's where we are.
Okay, so fascinating. With your permission, I want to go back to an earlier book of yours, Shall Religious Inherit the Earth? And I want to ask you basically the same question that I asked Professor Steven Pinker 2 weeks ago, but I will phrase it differently. Okay? Moses Mendelssohn, which was the father of Jewish enlightenment, tried to fuse Judaism with Western culture. However, all of his children, most of the children, all of his grandchildren converted to Christianity. Now, we also know that current liberal trends in the West are associated with low birth rates, and you also elaborate in this in the book. This is basically promoting concern about the long-term viability of liberal values. And my question is that do you believe that liberal societies with a low birth rate can sustain their values over the long term, or will the demographic rise of culture of religious group force a major cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I remember asking Pinker, is religion rational? That is not necessarily the doctrines, but long term, first of all, it's associated with, personal happiness, but more importantly, civilizationally in terms of birth rates. And I don't think he had a good answer necessarily because the
Neither to
problem,
me, neither to me.
I think he sort of, the problem is now that the whole fertility collapse and birth rate collapse is when I wrote my book, that was in 2010, I believe, 2011, 10 years, no, 13 years ago. All of the trends that were going on then have become more extreme since. So the birth rate collapse is more extreme than it was then. We're now looking at lowest low, so below 1.5 children per woman across much of the developed world. And so I almost think we have to imagine that we're in an evolutionary bottleneck, a bit like the bottleneck of, the small groups of humans that left Africa and became the ancestors of all the Asians and Europeans. Similarly, I think we're going through this population bottleneck because no societies that are secular can figure out how to get birth rates above replacement level. Even France, which is the closest case, France is the closest case, and they are, they're short by certainly at least a half child. So whereas, Israel is an example of where,
I just
this
wanted
is
to ask you whether Israel is an exception or Israel is not a secular society.
well, the thing is that Israel's fertility increase has been driven by the most religious Jews. It's now, of course, even secular Jews have a replacement level birth rate, which is they are the only secular population in a developed country that I know of that has replacement birth rates. It could be that the reason they have replacement birth rates is you've got a pronatalist culture that was largely created by the religious Jews. I don't know what the truth of the matter is, but I think what you see in Israel is a microcosm of what I'm talking about, which is that essentially those who are strict members of strict religions. Now, if you take the Haredim, obviously with their sky high birth rates and maybe religious modern Orthodox are lower, but they're still high. So I think and in fact, across the entire developed world, the strongest predictor of family size is religiosity now, not women's education, because all women are educated basically. Whereas in Africa, yeah, okay, women's education is going to matter because it's going to matter for fertility rates because they're still in a sort of they're going through their demographic transition. But in places that have gone through the demographic transition, it's basically about religiosity as the most important factor. So whether house prices are up or down, or you have AI or whatever, I don't think that's going to make much difference to the fertility rate. So this is a huge crisis, and yes, liberalism is heavily implicated, especially secular liberalism. And so now, if you take Israel, I mean, it's got what I would call procedural liberalism. It has freedom of expression, and so it does have this culture. But I would say the issue in Israel would be if the Haredim were to take over demographically, then I do think that liberal culture could be under threat in the sense that how women dress. Will women be free to dress the way they want? Will billboards be free to show a woman's face? These sorts of things. It's likely that if the Haredim become the majority and they take over, then the freedom will be lost. As long as that can be prevented, then I think probably you will be able to preserve the procedural liberties in the system.
I must tell you, as an Israeli, I'm not a Haredi, but I must
Yeah.
tell you, as an Israeli, that the current debates in Israeli about the future, the cultural future of Israel, I think raise a very specific point about the Haredim. The Haredim don't want to be next to the will of the country. They don't want to lead. So even if they be a majority, unless a very major shift will happen, they have this culture of sitting in the back of the bus, not being in front and lead. And this is part of the thing, going to the army, etc. And but I think that yes, Israel can be an exception. You say, okay, there is a correlation between birth rate and religiosity, but even the secular Israeli has a higher birth rate than all the Western world. So maybe we can learn something about the secular Jews in Israel.
Yes, and I think also, if you're looking, there's a book by Paul Morland, Tomorrow's People. Who is going to be on the planet in 500 years? Do we think that there will be many South Koreans in 500 years given I mean, the question is really, what is the future of secularism? People who have no religious affiliation and this is a difficult problem, and we haven't really seen anyone really address it properly. So I think we know that Israel will still be there in terms of its demography. It may be that Israel is supplying migrants to Western countries. I mean, there will be 300 million Amish in the United States in the 2200s. They might become a large share of the American population. The people who are going to replace the thing that liberals are, and I always stress this, is you can't just have declining birth rates without replacement. I mean, decline means replacement. So if you are in a population fertility collapse, you're going to be replaced. And you have to, and this is something that just has not, that penny has not dropped. You ask people, is fertility collapse a problem? And those on the left will overwhelmingly say no. Oh, that's a good thing, good for the planet, good for this and that. They just don't understand what that means is secular people are going to be replaced by religious people. And eventually that penny is going to drop. I don't know when it's going to drop, but eventually it will. All I would say is that it hasn't dropped yet.
And you started with emotions, and I think what separate secular then from religious societies is transcendental values, values that don't rely solely on enlightenment, on rationality. And again, Steven Pinker has a great book, Enlightenment Now,
Hmm.
but he has a very hard time explaining what happened in Germany between 39 and 45. Okay, this was like the most enlightened nation on Earth, on the history of planet Earth, but it not just did the Holocaust, it invented the Holocaust to degrees of atrocities that the human eye has never seen up until Gaza. And my last question, which is about related to philosophy, and you're a social scientist, so but I still must ask you, in Shall Religious Inherit the Earth, you argue that the demographic trends favor religious groups due to their higher fertility rates and cultural cohesion. Now, Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, explore how Western society transitioned from a worldview where belief in God is assumed to one which is merely an option. And my question is, how do you reconcile those two perspectives? One showing a rise in religiosity through demographics, and the other move toward secularity. Can those trends exist together, or will they eventually clash?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, I had a term at Harvard as a visiting fellow when Taylor and Michael Sandel were doing a seminar on the secular age. And so I remember that book very well. I mean, my view is quite simply this, that the culture in the West pushes people away from religion. So Taylor's right, the secular age is right, the culture has been moving in a secularizing direction. Um, but global population dynamics and demography move societies in a desecularizing direction. So the question is only which of these two forces is stronger at any one moment. My view is that in the long run, the demographic forces are going to be dominant. in the short run, the secularizing forces are dominant. Now, I think that by 2050, we're going to start to see the desecularizing forces become more and more dominant. Give you an example. London and a lot of major cities like London and Paris in Europe are the religious hotspots of their particular countries. Why? Well, because you have demography, religious immigration. London, religions, including Christianity, have barely declined, and in some parts of London, they've increased as their share of the population, because Britain is one of the few places that has a census that asks about religion. So we can see this. And that tells you that demography is starting to slow the secularization process and reverse it in the immigration gateway cities. That will eventually become the pattern in the country as a whole, as the country is remade through immigration. And so what I would say is, and there's actually in population projections, this is another branch of demography. What matters in the long run in a population projection is usually the birth rate differential, fertility. In the short run, factors like switching between religion and secularity are more important. It's the short run, cultural stuff matters more in the short run. Longer run, however. Now, you might say, well, it's always possible that we come into a symbiosis where, the religious produce the children, but enough of them go secular that it replenishes the secular population.
Mhm.
And that is a possibility. But what I would say is that the world-denying religious sects, which are the fastest growing, like the Haredim and the Amish, are very good at keeping the children in the fold. So the leakage into the mainstream secular society, you cannot guarantee that that's going to be sufficient to offset the rise of the deeply religious. I think ultimately the deeply religious will eventually become dominant. That's at least the trend in a number of societies. It'll take longer in some places, but I just don't see what the answer from secular liberalism is to that just yet. Now, I think in China, there the regime could very simply say, this is how many kids you're allowed to have. The highly religious, you're restricted to two kids. China can do that because they're an authoritarian society. I don't think in the Western context with liberalism we can do that.
I want to just mention one thing about religious people producing unreligious people as an unconverted process. And there
Yeah.
is a term in Israel, in Hebrew, which called datlash, which is dati לשעבר and ex-religious. But the sociology of ex-religious is very interesting because ex-religious, we say in Israel, wants his child to also be ex-religious. But his child cannot be ex-religious. His child can be secular. So ex-religious has, okay, I got these dogmas of the Torah, of religion, and I cherish them as some of my youth, but I cannot give them in such a way to my child because I don't believe in them. So any ex-religious want his son to also be ex-religious, but his son is secular, and the son and being secular and ex-religious is profoundly different.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is fascinating because there is this, no one can quite figure out how we get out of this birth rate collapse and why the religious element is so important. I mean, we know a number of things. Obviously, if you attend regularly, and then there are other mothers to help you spread the childbearing load, and there's more of a pronatal ethos, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that might be. But what's astounding to me is how long it's taking secular liberals to realize that they're being replaced and they will be replaced, and to actually think that this is a problem. They're not yet there. And it's really remarkable. I think they believe, for example, that, well, we can just keep bringing in immigrants and somehow that will solve it. But of course, one of the things that you find with religious immigrants is they stay religious and then they start to change your politics. So in Detroit, suddenly, Muslims are dominant in Hamtramck. They're going to get rid of Pride Month. Okay. Now all of a sudden you've got a problem.
And again, having many children means basically that some of the values of fulfilling yourself and going after your goal, going after your dream are less important than having more children. And liberal society cannot bear this notion. And I think this is where the secular societies needs to address. Okay, can we be a secular society where some of our values are higher than pursuing oneself's dream or oneself's goal?
I think you're right in the sense that I think for liberalism to survive ultimately in the long run, it is going to have to moderate on. I mean, you can always have subgroups in a society that are completely individualistic, and it's all a question of how large they are. So you still, I think, I would want to make sure such people are around and that they are protected. But the mainstream ethos of the society, I just don't think the mainstream ethos in Western societies is demographically sustainable. And I think there is a myth that somehow you can just bring in immigrants and they'll magically become secular liberal. And of course, the wheels are coming off that project in any case due to populism and polarization. So I really think part of this is that the dominant left liberal ideology, which I think has been dominant at least in the cultural elites since the liberal progressives of the early 1900s, and this dominant left liberal philosophy, I think, is reaching a crisis. And this crisis of progressivism, I think, is what's one of the interesting things of our time. Now, of course, they will always try and airbrush what's going on and say, no, 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 it's not a crisis of humanitarian egalitarian liberalism. This is really a crisis of capitalism, or they'll try and deflect it onto easier targets rather than looking at themselves in the mirror. But increasingly, I don't think they're going to be able to do that. And I think more and more, one of the things that is interesting about Trump's victory, for example, is it's actually inducing more self-reflection than I had anticipated amongst at least the sensible parts of the liberal left. They're starting to realize really two elections and in a more convincing way. Maybe we haven't got all the answers and we have to be a bit more humble. And I think one of the questions is whether this dominant left liberalism can be moderated and can be shifted back into something more reasonable. And that will involve part of what you said, which is sort of, yeah, again, also moderating this idea of focusing just on the individual and saying, well, actually, the community you're born into, the tradition, the society is also matters. You have obligations to it. It's not just about yourself. And whether we can get back to that is, I think, one of the big questions. So, yeah.
Y- Definitely. Religion is still relevant, tradition is still relevant, enlightenment is still relevant, and the fusion between them and the clash between them, I think, is more relevant than ever. Professor Eric Kaufman, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for sharing all your great ideas with us. We mentioned many books, and could you just name, beside your White Shift and Taboo, could you mention just one book that would you recommend people who listen up until now? It's like 70 minutes, which is great, uh, to read and to learn more about the subject?
Well, I mean, Daniel Bell is a great intellectual, one of the rare conservative sociologists from the mid 20th century. Now, his book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, I think is very important, really influenced me a lot. I was lucky enough to meet Daniel Bell just a couple of years before he died, and I had a correspondence with him for years before that. But one of the most important intellectuals, so Daniel Bell, Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. I would recommend 1976.
Oh, thank you so much. And my last, very, very last question. This channel was about productivity at the beginning. Could you just share with us one productivity tip, for young scholars, for young researchers, for people who want to get more things done?
Wow, okay. I would say the perfect is the enemy of the good. Just get it down on paper. Don't try and perfect it. Don't try and keep rewriting things. Just write it and good enough. Make it good enough, not
Oh,
perfect.
yeah, just like good enough mother, just make a good enough paper. Professor Eric Kaufman, thank you so much for your time. Again, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Thanks very much.